Hello all, this is Colette from Witch Ways, and I'm here today to talk about protective magic for mothers and babies. I've been getting a lot of questions lately about simple rites of passage like hand fastings, marriage, crossing ancestors over, baby birthings. And so I thought I would share a little bit of magic today about the birthing part, because probably the rest of this month I'm going to be doing a whole lot of stuff with adornment and roses and rose honeys and lots of things like that. So I want to get one more video in about just a rite of passage, and I'll continue doing this throughout the year, and I'll probably do one about crossing people over when we get closer to Samhain in the fall. The first thing I'm going to talk about is protection for the baby, and that is done by creating a quilt. And if you have someone in your community who's knowledgeable about quilt making, just turn it over to them in terms of the technical piece, and you take on the magical piece. The other thing that you can do is pre-buy a quilt that is already made and put together, and then have a magical circle for blessing the quilt and infusing it with protection. Or you can do kind of something in between where each person that comes brings a section of quilt that they have created, and then they get sewn together. And so the way that you do this magically is you have your quilt, and you can either sing a song of blessings as you're putting the quilt together, or just infuse it with that song if it's a completed quilt. Maybe beforehand you might want to check with the mom for a theme, if there's a particular energy that they would like put into the quilt. And you can also go around the circle, and as you're putting the quilt together or infusing the quilt with magic, have each person present speak to a wish that they would like to go into the quilt, or simply have each person one at a time breathe protection and general blessings into the quilt. Again, very important to check with the mother to see what kind of boundaries or ideas they might have around that. And another thing that you can do is use knot magic when you are putting the quilt together or finishing up. So knot magic is when you, as you tie a knot, you seal the magic in. And so with quilting, there's lots of opportunities to do that by taking thread through all the layers and then connecting all the layers of the quilt together, because typically there's an underneath layer, a layer of batting, and then the decorative top. And so you can put thread through all three of the layers and then knot it. And as you're tying the knot, you might say something like, by the power of 3 times 3, may this quilt be full of blessings, so mote it be. And that it's that simple that you can vary it in lots of ways. A variation on this quilting theme is to put some actual drawings or patterns of protection on the underside of the quilt that's next to the child. So this could be done if anyone knows embroidery, or simply anyone who knows how to sew. You could draw the pattern on the underside and then follow the pattern with needle and thread. The other thing you could do is to take water that you have charged with blessings and simply paint on the inside of the quilt those protective symbols with the water that you've charged, and then let it dry. And so those are some other variations on magical quilt making. The other thing that I like to do for the mother for protection is a motherwort charm. Motherwort is an herb. It's a very tall one that will take some shade. It's a member of the mint family. It can grow to be 5 to 6 feet high. It actually looks a lot like pot when it's growing. I've had people mistake it for pot before. And in general, the energy of this herb is very good for nerves, anxiety, the heart, in traditional medicine, but you don't have to take it internally to get those benefits. You can just have the plant around you. And the other thing that you can do is make a motherwort charm. And what that looks like is taking 3 sprigs of the plant. See, it looks a little tiny bit like marijuana. And just, I do the short tops. This time of year is perfect. And then just take some red string and tie the charm together and hang it somewhere in the house as birth starts. It's also really good for mothers, for protection for them. And also I find that it's really good for mothers who are in physical transition of some kind. They're uncertain where they're going to be living, or maybe there's been a partner breakup, or just something where things aren't quite going the way they had planned, which is kind of par for the course when you have a child. You're turning your whole life over to be one big long series of, whoa, that's not really quite what I had in mind, but okay, we'll roll with it. So motherwort can be very, very comforting to the heart of the mother, very protective of the mother. There is some evidence that it can start uterine contractions if taken internally. So I wouldn't have a whole ton of it and then lay it on the bed or anything like that, because it might bring the contractions on a bit harder. That's probably really stretching it to say that that could happen, but in this era, everyone needs to be really cautious about herbs, just because the traditional knowledge has been really lost. So another thing you can do with this is to dry the herb, or if you don't have this lovely plant growing in your garden, you can get some dried motherwort from the store. And I'll put the Latin name down below in the comments section below the description, or just in the descriptions actually. Just get some dried motherwort and tie it up in a silk square of cloth, or put it in a little sachet bundle to have in the room as the mother is giving birth. I would say if the mother is having to move, I would put the charm in the house for a while before you have to move, or put it up in the doorway as you're moving in, and then take it down until birth starts. The next bit of magic I want to do is about protection for babies and children, young children. And I want to talk a lot about birch. Birch, I did a whole video on it earlier this year, and I talked about it in one spell that you could do to protect children and small babies. And I'll put a link to that video either at the end of this one or down below in the description. But there's some other ways you can make birch charms for children. And in general, birch is super protective of babies and small children. Cradles were often made of birch baskets for carrying children. We don't do that so much these days. So what you can do is you can have a stick of birch, a birch branch as well, and just write on the branch maybe take some of the bark off and make a flat spot and then just write or carve into the branch symbols of protection, if you know any. I always like pentacles personally because they're stars. They're our oldest ancestor. And you could also just write the word protection and love on that bare spot and then hang that near the crib or in the child's room. Another thing that you can do is use birch bark. And there's a few different kinds of birches. Regular birch bark is very stiff and solid. It works really well. What you can do with that is you can take an awl, or sometimes even a paper punch will work, or an ice pick, and hammer it through and just make a hole through this stiff piece of birch, and then thread some red thread through it, and then draw your protective words or symbols or pictures on the birch. And I always use red thread for these kinds of charms because it's the color of life and the color of the mother. And then just loop a piece of thread through it and make a loop so that you can hang it somewhere in the room or near the baby where it's not going to fall in the crib for them to chew on. Although they probably really love that, but might not be so great for them. The other kind of birch is paper birch, and that's the kind that you see peeling off of branches and twigs, and it's I'll put the Latin name for the birch that is the paper birch down below in the description. And so what you can do with that one is get a curl of these birches, and this is an exceptionally big piece. A lot of the pieces are more typically this size, really about like this or smaller. This happens to be a really big one that I'm saving for something special. And then just unroll it, and then on the inside of it, write a letter of your intention of protection and just let it roll up. Tie it with string, red string, and again, hang it somewhere in the baby's room. Again, as I said, I like to use red thread for these kinds of things because red is the color of the mother and it's the color of life. The river of red is the river of DNA, the river of ancestors that flows through our veins as blood. Another charm that is useful for both children and mothers is a hawthorn twig charm. And that is especially useful to anybody who has European background, where hawthorn grows, or specifically in Rome and Italy, they use bundles of hawthorn twigs tied with a string and then put them in the cradle. Again, these days I would, unless you could put it somewhere in the cradle, like under the mattress where baby totally can't get it, I probably would put it somewhere nearby. Also, having it in the house is very nourishing and supportive for the mother. I often think of hawthorn as a very mothering kind of plant in its flower and fruit nature, although it's also associated with fertility and sexuality magically. My personal group of students have always felt very supported and nourished when they were under the canopy of hawthorn, but plant affinities are very personal. And so if you are a mother, you might want to spend some time with a hawthorn and see if it's a plant for you and how you feel when you sit with it. Another thing to remember is that people almost always do some kind of food train when there's a birth in the community. And you can put, if it's all right with the mother and their family, you can put your blessings, just infuse them with your hands and your energy or your breath into the food that you're preparing for them. Just some kind of simple blessing, nothing too specific, just general support, nourishment, and blessings. I hope you've enjoyed this. Please ask questions in the comments section and be well.